or -1 room. But in any case, let's go for it. So let's talk about why it is that we think forgiveness is an inherently morally problematic concept. That's my first point. Then what I want to do after that is play out 3 different scenarios about how this morally problematic nature of forgiveness actually plays itself out, how it always serves in the majority of cases to reinforce oppression, and why it's therefore not something we should regard generally as a virtue. So firstly, therefore, let's take a closer look at forgiveness. First observation I have is that we're not really debating forgiveness per se here, but a social norm which says that it is a virtue. Note that all norms exert some level of coercive pressure on individuals and society to buy into them. I'm not going to say at this point it's unjustified, but note that these norms can be especially oppressive if they interact with things like religion or pre-existing oppressive structures in order to reify those morally problematic outcomes. The second, much more important point I want to make is that we think forgiveness is inherently a morally problematic concept. Why? Because it essentially looks in the teeth of moral evil and says, let us close the book on this one, let us not do anything. Right? It's quite different from saying something bad has happened, I don't forgive you for it, but let's find a pragmatic way forward. Forgiveness is an explicit invitation to whitewash that from the moral record, as it were. Why is this problematic? Because when we're faced with moral evil, we should do either one of 2 things. We should either put the moral evil right, or we should in some sense punish the person who is responsible for doing it so it does not happen again. The problem is that forgiveness prevents that from happening, and I'll give you more detail on how that plays out later. But no, the argument for forgiveness, which says that, well, ultimately the wrong was done to you as an individual, so if you forgive it, then there is no more moral wrong in some sense. We think that argument does not work for a couple of reasons. Firstly, even if you have been wronged, let's say, if I had an abusive boyfriend, even if I forgive the abusive boyfriend, the fact remains that I today am in a worse off situation than I otherwise would have been if that moral evil was not done to me. So objectively, that structural disadvantage persists. Secondly, this notion would render the concept of moral right and wrong completely arbitrary, because depending on what people happen to feel, then horrific things could potentially become completely morally unproblematic. But lastly, and most importantly, harm is not individualized. If I forgive an abusive boyfriend, that boyfriend is going to assume that other people in the future are going to extend that same courtesy to him. And this could happen for interpersonal relations, it could happen between entire ethnic groups, it could happen between the rich and the poor. Evil is never individualized, and what forgiveness does is that the pressure to forgive does, is that it acts on the most vulnerable individuals who have no choice but to forgive, and uses that as an excuse to more broadly justify oppression elsewhere. So, what does that mean actually in practical terms? This is all fairly abstract, I grant. Firstly, what forgiveness does, or the pressure to forgive does, is that it continues structural oppression, or at least makes it easier for that structural oppression to continue. Note, for instance, that when the slaveholding states in America were forced to basically comply with the changes in the US Constitution, a major argument which was made was that the returning slaves, or the freed slaves, should forgive their masters because that was a uniquely Christian virtue to do, to turn your other cheek. So when it comes to structural oppression, this often interacts with pre-existing norms created by the majority in order to ask for the dominated minority to be quiet, to be meek, and to be afraid. Note, furthermore, a corollary of this is that forgiveness views anger as an inherently problematic response to moral evil, because anger is kind of the diametric opposite, right? It represents a continuing frustration with the fact that this evil has not been righted. What this means is that notions of forgiveness are politically weaponized to discredit groups like Black Lives Matter. Very damagingly, what happened, for instance, when that black guy, who got filmed in the bird park, when he said, I forgive that woman, right, the white woman who was filming him, when he said, I forgive her because she's already lost her job, I don't want her to suffer, that got weaponized by the entire apparatus of the US's right-wing machinery to say that this is a civilized response to a civilized black man who belongs to our society and knows how to fit in. Note, though, that the violence which has actually happened and the general anger of BLM has nonetheless proven to be extremely effective, right? We see a large, or about 60% of America, which is fairly radical, now supporting the cause of Black Lives Matter on at least some level. So what we want is not for forgiveness to act as a stumbling block to these kinds of broadly successful movements. We'd like them to be more successful than they are. And we think the narrative that forgiveness is an inherently noble and virtuous thing, especially when it's paired with broad notions of what it means to be a good Christian person, we think this is very problematic, but rather that norm just didn't exist. That's the first context in which we think this plays out structurally. Secondly, we also think this plays out structurally when it comes to interpersonal relations, where toxic dynamics are often brushed off as being a function of your individual weakness. So the example I gave you earlier about interpersonal relations between a man and a woman, women are very often told, right, that if they have an abusive boyfriend or abusive spouse, to just let the matter go. And not just in a pragmatic way, but they're told that, you know what, don't let the guy dictate your life, even though he's gone. Just forgive him and move on. And that kind of toxic narrative, which ties forgiveness to your own psychological well-being, what it actually does is that it takes individual human vulnerability and weaponizes it to ensure that the person who was abused, the person who behaved in a toxic manner, is never going to get meaningful punishment from that person, never going to get retribution for the wrong they did. And if we think, you know, the individual who forgive, maybe they're better off because they're psychologically, they feel a bit more at home with themselves. Firstly, that's often not the case, right? Because we know that one of the best ways to close these psychological wounds is actually have some kind of authority. Maybe it's a court of law, maybe it's an arbitration, maybe it's a family court, to actually decisively say that you are the victim and you are wrong and you deserve some kind of compensation. But secondly, even if this wasn't true, this is not just about you, right? Because the harm of these things are not individualized, because that person is likely to do these harms to other people in the future because they were forgiven in this particular instance. Furthermore, this also ties into very toxic things like victim blaming, right? One of the ways in which forgiveness manifests itself is in saying, well, we are all sinners, so we should all forgive each other because we are all fallen in the eyes of God or the patriarchy or whatever, right? But saying that we are all sinners ties into toxic narratives about maybe I was the person at fault for being abused, and that's incredibly harmful as well. Lastly, post-conflict reconciliation. What happens is that in societies which have had kind of large-scale conflicts, when we do things like truth and reconciliation councils, which don't take the language of let's find a pragmatic way to move forward, which countries like Rwanda do with having consociational parliaments, for instance, but an explicit language of forgiveness, of looking past that moral evil, the continuing effects of that moral evil cannot be discussed objectively in current political discourse. Look at land redistribution discussions in South Africa, for instance, right, where huge quantities of wealth are still held by whites, but every time that's brought up, people say, this kind of a racialist narrative is precisely what the TRCs were designed to get past. This is what we're supposed to have forgiven each other for. We should build our society anew. But there's no possibility of building society anew unless you are angry and determined to root out the evils of the past. For all these reasons, extremely proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for the speech. Now to begin the debate from opening opposition, may I call upon the Leader of Opposition?
Just 1 second. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. 3 points I'm going to bring to you in this speech. Firstly, what forgiveness actually looks like and what's the likely comparative. Secondly, on a personal level, why we believe that's a much better mechanism, and that forgiveness is a much better mechanism than alternatives. And finally, on a societal level, why again this is a preferable method. Before that, one extreme point of rebuttal. Note that Ashish mostly discusses when he discusses the problematic aspect of forgiveness on a societal level between oppressors and oppressed and so on. They only deal with one side of the debate. When the problematic part where a minority forgives the one who have wronged them. We don't think that, first of all, we just don't think, unfortunately, that in most cases, an oppressed minority has the ability to do much more than that. We believe that when they act in violence, that is usually met with violence, with much larger violence from the other side. We don't think they have the societal power to actually make the sort of difference that Ashish is talking about. And we believe what usually ends up is a cycle of retribution that is much worse for them. However, we believe that what Ashish fails to mention is the fact that there is also the notion of the oppressor also seeing this as a virtue and saying they have to forgive things like crime, things like not meting out collective punishment or not meting out too harsh punishments for attempts to rebel. We believe that is also a very, very good thing, and probably a more important one given the way power is unevenly distributed within society. What is the comparative and what does forgiveness actually look like? Because OG basis is a world where only this narrative exists and the most extreme version of it. We just don't think it is likely that how forgiveness looks for the great majority of people, apart from some monks hidden out in some monasteries somewhere in medieval Europe. We don't think anyone actually conceives of forgiveness in the way that Ashish says. We don't think anyone says, oh, someone has wronged me, I will go out of my way with no attempt whatsoever from their side to repair anything and just forgive them. Why is that? Because just like this norm is highly influential, there are also other really influential norms, such as prioritizing myself, such as the idea of punishing someone who's done me wrong, such as the idea of desert. Therefore, we think that the likely scenario is people adopting a more pragmatic view of it, which means they have both the narrative of sometimes it is forgiveness is the right virtue to exercise. In other cases, other virtues are important to exercise. Secondly, note that we, as a biological tendency, our tendency is to take revenge. Why is that? Because we're biologically programmed to prioritize ourselves as individuals and to deter others from harming us. Therefore, what we say is that the value of virtue is a balance against all those other things that, when taken alone, are rather problematic. Why is it unlikely that the comparative is just pragmatically moving forward as OG suggests? First of all, we just don't know why pragmatically moving forward solves anything that forgiveness has not solved. Like, we don't think that this leads to any of the deterrence or retribution or all of the other things Ashish wants to say. Note that criminal courts happen under our world. Like, we do prosecute people. We don't think that is a significant delta. And we just don't think the notion of something has happened and we move on provides any sort of emotional closure. Therefore, we say the likely comparative is actually people taking vengeance, meaning trying their best to harm someone back as opposed to the harm they have that person has caused to them. On a personal level, why do we believe that our comparative is much, much better? First of all, as I've said, we believe that, let's put it this way, there are cases in which someone has wronged you because they are evil and because there's some problematic moral problem that they have. We believe in this case, first of all, people can assess within their interpersonal relationships which is the more likely scenario and act accordingly because they have all those competing narratives. And we believe, on the other hand, there are many situations where it's just a misunderstanding, where someone actually cares about you but has done something wrong. And we believe in these cases, it is much preferable to actually be able to resolve the thing between you, forgive that person and move on. And we believe that is much more likely to happen when you have this narrative as well within your toolkit of narratives, quote unquote. But why is their world significantly worse? Well, a few things in which vengeance or retribution is a much, much worse mechanism. First of all, it's very hard to take it in a measured way, in a proportionate way that actually measures the amount of harm that has been caused to you. Often what will happen is someone does something bad to you, you will do something twice as bad to them, then and that in itself just means that this is a problematic way, but moreover, it encourages counter-retribution or counter-vengeance because that person also does not forgive you. And the likely scenario is they feel wronged, and then you end up in this never-ending cycle of, in the worst case, like blood feuds and so on. But we think that dynamic also applies in interpersonal relationships in the sense of just wronging each other more and more. Secondly, we believe that just more harm is done to the world because the idea behind retribution is X damage is being done to me, I need to exact another X damage. We believe that means significant on a utilitarian level, much more damage is being done. We believe that's bad. Thirdly, we think vengeance doesn't even satisfy my emotional needs to the same extent because I never know that the person has actually suffered enough. I don't know when it is enough to correct for what has happened to me. And we believe, again, our system is a much better one when someone recognizes a specific offense, recognizes the way in which they have wronged you and apologizes for that, and you forgive them for that. That is a much better psychological closure. I will now take closing for POI. Closing?
Sorry, I had typing stuff.
What?
Okay, so on your side of the house, you think that the narrative forgiveness applies to people as a counteracting measure, but instead, forgiveness disproportionately applies to some people and doesn't counteract vengeance, but forces docility.
Thank you. Schulman is going to address specifically the issue of which groups it applies to more. I'm going to go on to the societal stuff now. We say the entire point of rehabilitation relies on the notion that says you should forgive people for the bad they have done and embrace them back into society. That notion, we believe, is quite a radical one that has not existed for the majority of the history of criminal retribution. We believe that it can only happen in a world where forgiveness is seen as a strong virtue. We believe the alternative to this is just harsher and harsher sentencing meant to either punish the person or just neutralize them as a threat. We think that is a much worse situation, given that often crime is something that happens for societal reasons and for reasons that can be fixed. We believe that the idea of someone can actually get forgiveness from society and reintegrate after having done something terrible is something that can only happen when we see when you say forgiveness is a virtue. We're very proud to oppose the motion. Thank you very much.
I thank Leader of Opposition for the speech. Now to continue the case on government, may I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I first want to clarify what exactly we mean when we talk about forgiveness as a virtue. Because if you listen to the language of the opening opposition, they presume that forgiveness is anything that allows us as a society to progress forward past wrongs that have already happened. We don't think that's necessarily true. And the point of this debate is to question whether or not, in the face of a moral wrong, whether forgiveness is a response or anger as a response in which you seek to correct those particular norms aims for a better and more equal outcome in future for the society at the end of the day. Let's deal with this one by one. Firstly, I want to talk about this criminal retributive aspect. Look, there are two kinds of crimes that exist broadly when it comes to criminal retribution. The first, presumably, are crimes in which there is no real victim. So, for instance, if you're a poor person who steals things, for instance, the point here is not about forgiving the individual for committing a wrong, but the recognition that what they have done is not a moral wrong in the first place. This is distinct from the notion of forgiveness, because forgiveness means accepting that a wrong has occurred, but then choosing to move past that wrong and sort of wiping the slate clean. The point here is that when circumstances force an individual into having to steal, for instance, to survive, this is the point in which society has failed the individual. And it's not a question in which we demand forgiveness from that particular individual as well. So I think in those kinds of crimes, then perhaps rehabilitation is something that can still exist in the world in which forgiveness is not seen as a virtue. And in fact, the notion that we ought to forgive is probably something that the poor ought not be forced to internalize, because they ought to be fighting for their right to live with equal access to things that exist in society anyway. But then what about the secondary category of crime that I think OO doesn't really want to talk about? To the extent to which there's been a victim that's been harmed in the process of that particular crime, for instance, sexual assault, kidnapping, or murder, for instance, there is no actual reason that they give us why exactly forgiveness ought to be seen as a morally superior trait to that of holding on to your grievances and ensuring that and seeing those things as a continued moral wrong that a person ought to be punished for. So they give us no reason why exactly we ought to preference forgiveness over retribution, and why that is not a morally acceptable thing for individuals to care about. Which moves on to the secondary part of this characterization, that we have a toolkit of virtues that we can look at, and this is just one of many. First of all, that is empirically untrue. To the extent to which to say something is a virtue is to prescribe moral correctness to that particular virtue, which means that if you choose not to forgive, you are actively committing a moral wrong, and society shames you and pressures you to do the converse. But the bigger problem, and therefore there's no actual ability for you to choose with regards to things like moral desert or not. But I think what they missed out in the analysis from Ashisha's speech was that this particular norm actually does this in an unequal fashion, which means that this notion that they are talking about with regards to this idea that we can choose things only applies for those who currently already in the structures that exist have the power to be able to say, aha, but now I forgive you, or I should not forgive, no, I don't forgive you. Because to say that you don't forgive is to be able to withstand the shame that society visits upon you, but more crucially, to also have the capacity to continue to say that you don't want to forgive. So for instance, if you are an individual who was oppressed in the past, for instance, and or if you are a woman who came from an abusive relationship, the way that society tells you that you ought to forgive means that you find it incredibly difficult because you don't have the political capital to withstand the societal pressure that exists upon you. This can manifest ways that are incredibly direct and practical as well. So for instance, when a woman says, for instance, that she doesn't want to forgive a previously abusive boyfriend, the way that this tends to interact is that individuals don't want to associate with her because she's given a title of like a mad woman, for instance. These are things, and the way that forgiveness is construed to be a virtue has actual implications in the way that people are able to actualize the rights that come out from it. But then secondarily, right, where is forgiveness a better way of getting to the outcomes that you want in an equal society, or is anger a better way? Let's systematically analyze what OO gives us as alternatives. The first thing they tell us is that we can have peaceful processes of change, but then again ignores the analysis that comes from Ashisha's speech about how, first of all, peace is not something that is uniquely tied to the notion of forgiveness, in the sense that if you are just because you don't forgive doesn't mean that you can't also come to a pragmatic consideration that violence specifically is not the only means forward. But the question then is whether or not you seek to continually extract things like reparations from the oppressors that visited harm upon you. A notion of forgiveness suggests that we wipe this slate clean. These reparations don't have to matter any longer. And for example, maybe you want to take a needs blind approach, like for instance, giving out welfare in a needs blind fashion. But this completely ignores the reality that it was a harm that was visited upon a specific community of individuals that resulted in this inequality in the first place, which means that the moral wrongness in terms of its quantity is significantly larger than other individuals that just happen to be in a situation that seems to be kind of unfair and not as great for them. Then they said courts and legislation. Look, they literally got the timeline backwards, in that you can't just presume that courts and legislations are going to work for you in the absence of a movement in the beginning that allows for the agitation to occur. So they tell us violence will never create any sort of outcome. Anger never creates any sort of outcome. Look, forgiveness is literally silent, so you have no ability of vocalizing the wrongs that have happened. But if you want to look at an example of like anger resulting in like actual outcomes, first of all, look at Amrit. Second of all, look at the Black Lives Matter movement and the way in which they were able to agitate for those changes precisely because they refused to accept forgiveness to be the only virtue that they ought to take on and silence themselves. Is there anything from Xiao? If not, then I'll take one from OO. No? Okay, no POIs whatsoever. All right.
We have a
yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
You keep presuming that there is only one narrative. I can say that both being strong is a virtue and being just is a virtue and forgiving is a virtue, and people prioritize different things in different scenarios.
That literally makes no sense, in that when you say something is a virtue, you presumably say that these things are virtues because it's morally correct, irrespective of the context in which these things apply in, and you therefore say that at all of your analysis about how you shouldn't fight back because you create response to it, and the stuff about how if you let your anger go, you're likely to be a happier person. Like, these are all things that you can't just contextually as a norm, which is vague in itself, tell people specifically in this context this is correct, in that context that's correct. Like, that's just soft and just copying out, right? Okay, the next thing that they say is the idea of equivalent exchange and how you that this creates more retaliation. First of all, majorities can't forgive, or they don't need to forgive because they are the majority. So the question is whether the minority is able to agitate for certain kinds of change. We argue again that this is likely to be more successful because you are able to express why those things are problematic. But the second thing about how you can't actually morally create equivalent exchanges when it comes to whether or not enough wrong has been meted out upon you. This is not an argument to explain why forgiveness is a morally superior trait that we ought to care about. It is just an argument to suggest for other things like, for example, proportionality and figuring out whether or not things are correct or wrong. The point here that is important to note is that to the extent to which you argue that you can have choice or etc., that choice is one that is unequally distributed among individuals and pressure people to differing extents that only rarefy existing power structures that exist. As long as you can't get over the fact that norms apply unequally, we think opposition can never win this debate.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for the speech. Now, to end the upper house debate, may I call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Three, two, one, go. I have a bit of rebuttal, then we're going to talk more about what really changed in this debate on the personal and the social level, and then finally we will talk about women. Before that, very important, their notion of what it means to regret that forgiveness is a virtue is a wrong notion. Imagine I have told you the motion would be about whether generosity is a virtue. And then an opening government would say, well, sometimes people who are piss poor, they cannot give their money to anyone else, yet they keep on doing it, making the situation detrimental for them. Oh, how terrible that is. We would come and say, okay, but this is not how this narrative actually exists in society. In society, sure, people are forgiving, not all the time, in specific circumstances where they find it fit. And what they keep on telling us is that people would do it in times that do not fit, ignoring the times where it does fit, but B, never really answering why would people keep on doing it if it's so bad for them. What do we tell you? And this, let's go on to some direct rebuttal. Okay? They say it's either forgiveness or anger, and it should be anger. No, no, no. Please notice. On our side, you still get angry. You are soothed by forgiveness. Sometimes you realize you need to give up on the anger. Sometimes it's just because you cannot do anything with that anger. And if that's the case, maybe you should just feel better about yourself. But sometimes it's just because the anger is really non-pragmatic. Now, this is crucial because they are telling us, no, no, you can be rational. You can move on to more pragmatic solutions. Yes, but you can only do that only once the anger is soothed, only once the negative emotion that makes you want to harm that person that would still exist on both sides, only once that dissipates. And this dissipates only once you're able to forgive, or at least considering forgiving that person. You realize that this is something that you should do, and then you can move on to pragmatic solutions. If that's what you want, you get them more on our side. On your side, you get a cycle of violence that is never clear how it ever gets solved, because people might realize that a cycle of violence is not a good thing, but they, once they're in it, they still want to exact revenge more and more and time again. Finally, they say this is not a problem. You can just recognize that the other person that did something to you wasn't really wrong. Hey, that sounds a lot like forgiveness if you look at it from their perspective and you realize they had good reasons and so on. But we just think that it doesn't happen usually. If I'm a store owner and someone stole bread from my face, I'm not going to say in a world without forgiveness, oh, but he was poor. I'm going to say, fuck him, he took my bread. This is my money that he took. The only way for them to consider not doing that is if forgiveness is a virtue. They say, wait, maybe this is a person I should forgive too. Which brings me directly to talk about what happens on the level, on two levels. So first of all, on the personal level, OG says you need a third party to acknowledge your harm. Why? It was never really established. More than that, we think you actually want the person harming you to say that they were sorry. A, because this is the ultimate acknowledgement. I won't force them. This is just something that they have done themselves, and therefore they acknowledge your pain much more. But B, as we said, on our world, we still have courts. We'll still use them. You can still have all of what they want on our side. What you can get on their side is especially all the other times that are not about courts. Personal feuds all of us have. Imagine how many relationships would just be terminated if you couldn't resolve issues easily and simply because you kept on thinking who hurt who, how much, and how much revenge they should happen. It even gets worse because then people hide what they did. They would never admit what they did, and all they would do is hide the fact that they harmed you because they know that you would not forgive them. This is worse on their side. Then on the social level, because they say you expect minorities to now be peaceful and forgiving. Yes, but if they are not peaceful, you are more likely to be forgiving them for not being peaceful. This is what we see with the Black Lives Movement, that many people in the US support, exactly because they say we understand that they are being violent, we forgive them for it because we understand all the hurt that we have caused them over the years, and that is what we're sorry for. So again, forgiveness coming from the majority is crucial. This is much better than if the majority would say, oh, those terrible people, look what they're doing and they're rioting in the streets, let's send the National Guard and kill them all, right? This is a much better solution on our side. But then they secondly said, oh, but people, wrongdoers might just be more likely to do it because they know they would be forgiven in the future. Again, not how it works. As Ayan has explained to you, the exact problem with revenge is that you never know how much you hurt someone and therefore how much revenge is equal. This means that they, in fact, don't know how much revenge you're actually likely to accept on them. They don't know if what they did was actually wrong. As we said also many times, it's just a mistake and something that they didn't mean to begin with. So for all of that, just this is not a good way to deter people from doing terrible things. And again, we still have systems to do it. We still have courts. You don't know that the person will, in fact, forgive you if you've hurt them too much. So again, nothing really changes there. On our side, you have cycles of violence that just don't end. And you have more emphasis in the justice system of the rehabilitation of people into society, because society has forgiven them and doesn't just want to break them in order to reintegrate them. We say both of those are huge things that explain what's better on our side. Let's take a POI from OG.
Yeah, thanks. You know, if you don't forgive someone, you can take many other courses of action. You could demand an apology, you could go to the courts, you could peacefully protest, you could violently protest. Why will people always do the most irrational way of, you know, realizing their desire for justice?
Yes, actually. A, demanding apology sounds a lot like forgiveness, but B, they go for the most extreme example because they are angry, and angry people are not rational. The anger is not taken away on your side. It's the forgiveness that soothes the anger, as we talk. Finally, let's talk about women, because they are going to say, oh, but women may be expected to be more forgiving. On their side, women would be expected to be less vengeful or more understanding or anything like that. So we really do not know what changes on their side. But their side is a lot worse to women. Why? Because please notice, some of these acts of revenge are against women. Maybe husbands feel that their women, if they were being disobedient, this is something that they should not forgive them. They should take revenge on women as well. We say in a world that has no forgiveness, being a person with less power is worse, because you cannot exact revenge on your own, but people might be more accepting of you in a world of forgiveness. For all those reasons, we beg you to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Now, to begin the debate in the lower house, may I call upon the Member of Government.
I think it's very tempting in this debate to go for massive impacts about helping post-conflict societies and empowering massive numbers of people who are constrained by norms that make forgiveness difficult. But I would posit that in these cases where there are power dynamics, these are actually the circumstances where forgiveness applies the least. This is due to the fact that you can always invent other kinds of justifications about why things that groups are doing are bad. I.e., if people are being angry, dominant groups will just hate them for other reasons because you're threatening their own power in some kind of way. Anger will deviate from other stereotypes and expectations about how groups are supposed to act. We would posit on closing government that this round is far more about how this narrative impacts individuals, and we're going to forward two extensions about why we are better. Firstly, we are going to prove why, due to a variety of reasons, this narrative coerces people to engage in forgiveness in cases where it is problematic, and then secondly, characterizing how this narrative actually operates and why it perpetuates massive emotional harms on an individual level. To be quite frank, I think that OG largely outframes OO, and a lot of other clash with OO will be integrated. First claim, why is this narrative uniquely coercive? The first thing to say here, which is going to be really important in outframing opening opposition, individuals have pre-existing biases in favor of forgiveness in the absence of this narrative. This is for a couple of reasons. The first thing to say is that we often know individuals whom we are forgiving, right? Forgiveness often applies on like a domestic level where people do things wrong. This manifests in a couple things. Firstly, there's often pressure from other people within your life to forgive this particular individual, i.e. like your parents might know your significant other, they like them as well, so they pressure you to forgive them. But secondly, love is a very, very complicated emotion. You've probably known this person for quite a lot of time. You probably see the best in them. You have memories that you cherish. And as a consequence, you have your own internal biases to probably see the best in them. Secondly, we have pre-existing biases in favor of forgiveness because it coincides with other values that we already valorize as a society and other virtues. So these are things like it is good to be kind, it is good to be generous, it is good to be empathetic, that are just inculcated in our moral systems and are a way that we socialize youth from a very young age. And these are very similar to forgiveness, right? Like, i.e., if you should be empathetic, you should see how you may have been complicit and wronged the other person. You should understand in their shoes why they may have treated you in a particular kind of way. So because there are other virtues virtues that are very similar to forgiveness, this is an additional narrative in the toolbox that overly biases individuals in favor of engaging in forgiveness in cases where it is incredibly problematic. Note, this is very important in outframing opening opposition's comparative of people are going to be really, really vengeant and hate other people. Because given that there are a variety of other social reasons about why we would tell people that forgiveness are good, I would actually argue that this just over-distorts our pre-existing moral calculus to engage in forgiveness in cases where it is problematic. The second thing to say under this coercive argument is that this narrative itself acts as an incredibly toxic kind of pressure. This is because individuals are biased in favor of wanting to see themselves as a good person. Religion often tells you to be a good person, but also people just like going to bed every single night feeling good about the kind of individual that they ultimately are. What this means is that you pressure people to opt into something that is deemed as being virtuous, to subscribe to an pre-existing social construct, which pressures you to be a good person at the end of the day. So what then are the massive impacts of this distorting our calculus? A couple things. Firstly, principally speaking, it is wrong to manipulate agency and choice in a fundamental way in some of the most important decisions of our life. Our choice to leave like an abusive partner, our choice about starting a new family becomes dictated by societal norms as opposed to our own free will. That I think is just the largest principal harm in this debate because it robs us of our like personhood in the most like important circumstances. But secondly, there's just a massive harm to utility that comes from coercion. I think that in front half, it was probably proven that in some cases forgiveness can be good, in some cases forgiveness is harmful. We said that we ought use the most balanced moral metric in deciding whether forgiveness is right for us, and we uniquely provide the linkage and the mechanization about why that happens under our side of the house, but not biasing people in ways that are problematic. Second claim, why does this lead to tremendous emotional harm on an individual level? The thesis of this claim is that forgiveness coincides with narratives of self-blame that are horrible for the emotional well-being of victim. I think that OG was a bit extreme in how they describe forgiveness in the context of relationships. I don't think it's often like whether you leave a person or not, because like very few therapists say go live back with your abuser, but rather it is often pressure that we place on individuals to come to terms with trauma that has happened in their past. Even if you do not live with your oppressor, you have an obligation to be able to forgive them. Crucially, this coincides with toxic narratives of self-blame that often exist, where you start making excuses for the other party and then instead place blame on yourself. This exists for a couple of reasons structurally. Firstly, in order to forgive someone, you often have to minimize what they have done to you to the point where you perceive them as being justifiable of forgiveness. This person is not a monster. They still have a lot of good qualities about them, so you implicitly gaslight the terrible things that they have done to you in order for you to still see them as being a good person in your own eyes. But secondly, forgiveness often entails accepting some part of emotional blame, because often, especially in like therapy, what forgiveness means is what did I maybe do in a particular kind of relationship to like mess up a circumstance to the point where I should place some blame on myself rather than on the other person. So you start asking yourself, how could I think better? Which shifts forms of responsibility away from the oppressor and onto yourself. On the ground, what this looks like is, as a victim of domestic violence, quite literally asking yourself, what could I have done better to avoid being hit? How could I have been a better spouse to avoid someone else cheating on me? Before I impact this in greater depth, I will take a POI from opening opposition. If not, does Xiao have something?
Sorry, is it closing or opening? Didn't you?
Opening.
Yeah. Xiao would like you to believe that whenever forgiveness is bad, it's due to a societal narrative, and whenever it's good, it's due to a natural tendency. What is the natural tendency that leads you to forgive a minority that riots on the streets?
I mean, I think I explained a lot of natural tendencies that exist under the status quo in terms of like wanting to have empathy, etc., that exist in all of these cases implicitly. Okay, so what then are further impacts of like why the self-blame is really harmful? Firstly, it fuels massive cycles of self-hatred that exist, where when you start blaming yourself, you start despising the kind of person that you were because you're responsible for your own relationship falling apart. I.e., when you tell yourself that you're not a good enough significant other for someone else to ultimately cheat on you, that is really harmful, and you start hating yourself. Note, the self-hatred tends to be very, very crippling because you blame yourself for some of the most important relationships falling apart that is terrible on an emotional basis every single day of your life. Secondly, it takes substantially longer for victims to do things like report crimes. This is because you start thinking that things like maybe a sexual assault was your own fault because of how you acted rather than the fault of another person. This is bad because the longer that you take to seek justice greatly and vastly harms your credibility of a victim overall. The final thing to say here is that this also perpetuates huge amounts of guilt on an individual level. Because I think that for some people, a lot of people gaslight themselves trying to forgive, but a lot of other people simply find this process impossible because of how horribly someone else in their life ultimately treated them. What this means is that if you're unable to forgive, you start thinking that there's something wrong with you emotionally, that you are not a good enough person, and you feel very guilty about your inability, even though it's ultimately that other person's fault. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to stand in closing government.
So what is the staging next?
Ashish, can you mute yourself?
All good.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Get started when I get started. Point one of extension. Let's have a conversation about morality itself. Now, we get close here, but nowhere near close enough from opening opposition when they say, well, it feels natural to want to punish people and to want to have some sort of retributive justice. I think what we need to point to, first of all, is something that Jean-Paul Sartre, we'll call him the big fella from now on, said very famously that existence precedes essence. And the existence that you're born into is an utterly arbitrary one. It is one where you see an enormous amount of suffering, death that makes absolutely no sense contextually, a huge amount of poverty, random instances that can't really be explained by some sort of governing authority. That is why people turn to religion and turn to some sort of enforcing mechanism to give them reason for their life. But importantly, this debate is a regret motion. So it really does happen all throughout the formation and history of modern society. So to some extent, it really precedes religion and how these religions developed. And what it talks to is, how do we decide to impose order and understanding upon this world? Because we say there is no, first of all, structural reason to explain why people, seeing all this violence, seeing all this destruction, will adopt one specific vision of this morality. And there's two reasons for that. The first reason is that obviously there is such intense ambiguity in the way in which morals play out. So you can intentionally want to do something good but lead to horrible accidents or horrible incidences, or you can have people who are terrible individuals randomly achieve successes and good fortune. But the second thing is, it is framed from the very beginning, from your perspective as an individual who wants to promote your own utility, who wants to succeed in the world, who wants to believe yourself to be a righteous and good person. So I think the first and most important thing here is that morality and what is seen as to be something that is worth forgiving is itself defined by you. That is why over history you have had these oppressions, and people didn't say women deserve the vote for so many generations and years. People didn't say that you actually deserve to have racial inequality. And yes, I know obviously OG is going to be like, that's the mechanism for our case, but I'm going to do some actual analysis rather than I'll explain why that was wrong with some really flippant historical points about for social change. Point here though is that you define what is moral and define what is just. So you say that some individuals aren't worthy of rights and others are. So there are no things to forgive per se, but importantly, in a world without forgiveness, there is no reason to construct that norm. Why is that the case? Because there is a great uneasiness at the point in which you see a harm and see immorality and you believe it's attributed to yourself. So you have two choices. Either you have this capacity under our world to forgive, at which point you have this resolving mechanism of acknowledging guilt, acknowledging fault, and wanting to forgive and move forward. Or you can define alternatively what morality should actually look like. Because if you can't resolve all these problems and you don't have a normal forgiveness and virtue, the task is simply too great because the ambiguousness of your own behavior, because of how much suffering exists in the world, because of how much hurt you can actually do. So that great uneasiness, first of all, leads you to sweep it under the rug. The second thing we say, we talk about the constitution of the individual itself. Now, opening opposition get kind of close here, but again, not quite when they say there's a hierarchy of norms. But importantly, this is a norm of virtue that rises above. It's the one that allows you to aspire. And yes, obviously you trade things off in that case, but the virtuousness is essential to the human condition. It's the idea that you're born into a world that defines what a good or bad identity is. So when you believe that forgiveness is good, you believe that it is something that you should hold up as fulfilling your current moral purpose. And this is very, very pivotal in this debate, because we say, linking this all together, that the powerful and the rich have the capacity to define what is and isn't moral, and they have done so throughout history. And as I'm about to explain mechanistically, one of the major corrective mechanisms to this has been an incentive to forgive. But importantly, and this is where we just completely nuke opening government, there's no, well, firstly, there are a variety of ways in which you define this morality. You define what is property, you define property and what is appropriate or what is just and what is proper. You control the courts, you control punishment, you can whip people for betraying you or being angry at you or defying you. You can control every other element of financial, so you can control their employment, etc. And what this framing therefore means, right, is that intentionality is most important. If material power is distributed in a way, which just knocks out OG completely, that if the poor and downtrodden revolt, well, how do you seek change opening in government? There was no explanation from you. And the answer is you respond with brute force. You jail them, you remove their jobs and employment, you create a master-slave dialectic of dependency. And our point here, right, is because there is no actual mechanism for change, the only way you achieve change is by creating a structural incentive for the powerful to actually concede. Now, I've warmed you up very nicely. Haven't quite approached the mechanism yet, but let's now discuss exactly why we believe that we can get this sort of change where the wealthy and the elites have a structural incentive to concede to the poor. That wins us the debate by a mile. Because you look at our analysis, it's enormous in scope. It's all of history, it's the development of society, and it has already completely knocked out both government teams because it is explained structurally why none of their practical impacts matter. But also look at the weight of our arguments. We're talking about concessions of moral harms like slavery, concessions of moral harms like inequality that don't rely upon an abstract and amorphous biological mechanism of opening opposition, but actually on a complex explanation of human nature. But here are some brand spanking new mechanisms to win us the debate. The first thing is that when you have a virtue that you want to concede to, the fact that you believe it is a benefit, you look first of all into yourself and you look for the capacity to reform. Because when there is no capacity to reform, when you say, oh, I've acknowledged this and what next, and there's constant suffering, then it's far easier to deny that. So the first thing is you look actively to try to concede and to forgive. The second thing is you reflect upon your own behavior, because if you see others forgiving, you want to interact in that behavior and you reform. The third thing is it makes you feel far better internally, because closing government says you have a moral burden on yourself, but the alternative is not having anything to do when you feel like you've done an ultra awful wrong. So even if either you neglect all wrongs or you're constantly feeling in a state of horror. Secondly, everyone is conditioned by this norm. It's a norm where across all races, across all genders in society, you recognize that forgiveness is important. So the third and important thing is you now have the temperament to forgive, because you bracket off something. You say, this is when we need to forgive. This is a past of justice and I'll forgive you for that, but we need to change into the future. The alternative is asking everyone to, repair for all of history and all of the future. That's something that no one would ever forgive to, because the kind of reparations you're talking about are so enormous and they'll be incredibly damaging. And the final thing is they set a threshold for reparation. There is an infinite amount of reparation that could actually exist. You bracket off an event as a discrete event. The final thing is it's often tied to specifically as a norm, giving something in return, because forgiveness is seen as insincere and illegitimate if you don't, to some extent, reconcile. So what have we explained to you? We've explained that there is no world where you don't define morality on your own terms unless you have forgiveness. Forgiveness nudges you towards a fairer and more equitable definition of morality, a definition of wrong, because you decide that you want to be a virtuous person, and that is critical, and that matters more than your maintenance of material property and your maintenance of the courts of law and your maintenance of power. That is why we are so proud to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition for this speech. Now to wrap up the government bench, may I call upon the government whip.
I prefer verbal POIs, just FYI. The frame by which you should understand the government case in this debate is very simple. From Closing Government, we tell you that the inherent problem of forgiveness, irrespective of whether or not it moves someone to act, is one in which it forces people to actually disassociate and not recognize their own feelings and their own validity. It is one that tells them that the person that they think others are and that the actions that they have committed are valid and justifiable, and gaslights an individual into perceiving that they themselves aren't legitimate in their own thoughts. And we think that is the most clear and damaging impact in this debate. I'm going to chat about 4 different things in this speech. First, I want to talk about characterization and how that affects the debate. Second of all, I want to talk about how this makes people feel and provide an extension and explain why we win the debate as a whole. Third, I want to talk about how this makes people act in dealing with the opening opposition. And fourth, I'm going to talk about the closing opposition extension and whether or not this is truly a way in which we can get proper reconciliation in the long run. First, on characterization, I want to point out that the opening opposition frame that there are multiple competing interests is actually very useful to our case, particularly given the fact that we say that forgiveness is individual in terms of its coercive power. And the reason why is simple, because in the largest cases in which you want to have revolts over things like slavery, it is very plausible that that will happen anyways, because there are other interests as to why it is the case that you would want to engage in that sort of revolt. So this debate is not about those most extreme circumstances. Rather, this debate is about the circumstances in which, on the margins, that narrative forgiveness is able to outweigh the way in which you view yourself particularly based on the fact that there are disproportionate biases towards forgiveness, not just women, but for everyone that Nehme provides you. And that is very important. What does this do to the open opposition case? I think that this also deals with a lot of the argumentation about retribution and trying to deal with vengeance. And the reason why is very simple. There are strong reasons why you would choose not to be vengeful. For instance, the fact that rehabilitation creates net good for society by ensuring that people don't reoffend in the future. So the burden from opening opposition in this debate was to prove to you that the fight for criminal retribution was greater than all the narratives that we identified on our side of the house. And given the fact that Nehme also points out that religious ethics and that other kinds of norms disproportionately bias someone towards forgiveness, it's very unlikely that you get the kind of retribution and vengefulness on their side of the house. So that's the important implication in this debate. Let's talk about how this makes individuals feel. And I think this is the winning extension that comes from our side of the house. First of all, I just want to be clear how we engage with this debate. Because from the opening opposition, they tell you that anger is a terrible emotion, that makes you unproductive and that you don't deal with issues in a proper way. We disagree. We think that anger is a very useful and important emotion, not just because it leads to changes in how you behave, but also because it's a process of coming to terms with the problems that existed. And this is what Nehme tells you. She says that people want to be good. So when they have this kind of norm that forgiveness is a virtue, they will always want to be forgiving of other individuals, even if anger is an appropriate emotion to have in these circumstances. It forces a person to feel guilty about themselves. But we also pointed out that this impact is massive because the corollary of forgiving someone else is oftentimes justifying the actions that they did. And justification in the worst kinds of scenarios, and particularly when it interacts with other norms about generosity, etc., includes the fact that you're going to say that the abuser was justified in their actions. This doesn't mean that you're not going to leave them, but it does imply that you're going to feel terrible about yourself and that you will gaslight yourself. I want to make it clear how terrible this effect is. The mental health crisis that we note, I think, happens for a variety of reasons. But we think that the mental health effects of feeling guilt and shame about yourself are damaging, that the effects of depression and PTSD and the inability to properly recognize the trauma and blame yourself, which perpetuates PTSD, is a massive harm onto the most vulnerable in the debate, and this is one that is a very plausible harm. I also want to point out that we did draw out practical impacts from this argument as well, though, because Nehme also identified the fact that people, even if they report an offense, will report it late. So your therapist might encourage you to go report, for instance, abuse, but you'll report it too late because of this narrative of forgiveness. And the problem is very different from what OG identifies, because when you report it too late, when you enter the court of law, you'll be questioned in terms of your credibility. You'll have slut shaming and victim blaming because people will say, if they did that, why didn't you report it earlier? This means that people aren't held accountable like opening government identifies, but as a more plausible mechanism, and also establishes why there are additional harm to women who are victim blamed and who are hurt overall. On aggregate, I think this is the most important argument in the round, given the plausibility and given how this is definitely going to affect one's psyche, even though the differing norms that currently exist might change one's behavior in unexpected ways. The third thing that I want to chat about then is how this makes people act. Before doing so, I'm going to take a POI from opening opposition.
We are defending status quo. CG tries to convince you, therefore, that people currently are more forgiving than they are selfish, angry, or irrational. We say the only reason society has the mechanisms that build up forgiveness is because of the virtue, a comparative you never deal with.
No, I mean, I think that in the status quo, we can point out that there are lots of reasons why people would forgive regardless, and that they will continue to forgive even more as a consequence of this policy. So I think that just saying we're defending the status quo doesn't actually do any analytical work in establishing what are the relative influences of different narratives.
Can we pause it for 1 second? Amira got dropped from the call. Incredibly sorry. Amira, are you back?
Yeah, I got dropped from the call for like a minute.
Even I was dropped, I guess.
What?
I guess it was just for last 10 seconds, maybe.
No, for me, it was longer than 10 seconds. Because I logged
Amira,
like...
what's the last thing you heard?
So the last thing I heard was Ayal asking POI and you were replying by saying that people will forgive regardless.
Mine was right before the POI. Like the last bit of analysis before the POI.
Okay.
So what I'd suggest in this case is, so I think for Amira, the drop is probably like 40 seconds-ish.
Yeah.
So it's 5 6:30 by my clock now, and the POI, as I remember, was asked at 4:50ish. I guess Jason can confirm.
I think about 4:50ish. I'm not certain, but I think that sounds about right.
All right. So what we can do in this case is probably, if you guys are okay with it, then I'll ask the POI again, and then you can start the debate if that's fine by you. Is that fine?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
Okay, then
Sure.
then we can give you like 3 minutes and 10 seconds, so that it's good for the panel overall. So I'm just checking if Ayal is here. If you're okay with asking the POI, then I'll just say 3, 2, 1, and then you can ask the POI, and we can start from there. And I'm starting a new stopwatch altogether.
Okay, sure. Just making sure though, Amira, what was the last thing you heard? What was the last thing you heard from Jason? Because it might be before I gave the POI, if we're doing this. Like more things lost.
So the last bit I heard was like the wrapping up of the analysis that like there are other norms that like basically directly responsive to opening opposition in terms of like there are other harms that are not necessarily linked to needing to be especially vengeful.
Did you get the part where I talked about victim blaming and such?
Halfway there.
Halfway there, okay. Okay, so should I finish that analysis and then move into Ayal's POI, or?
Yeah, that's fine actually. That was like 30 seconds before Ayal asked the POI. So in that case, I'll start my timer. I'll start my stopwatch and go for 3 minutes and 40 seconds left in your speech. So you can do that analysis, and then according to your convenience, ask Ayal to give the POI. All right?
Okay.
All right then. Thank you, guys.
But there is an additional practical impact that Nehme provided in this debate, because she told you that the likely outcome is not that women choose never to report at all, but that they simply choose to report at a later point. Their therapists will eventually encourage them to report, but their initial reluctance and their narratives of forgiveness will delay the time in which that happens. And the harm is that courts will wonder, why didn't you report it earlier? This is the kind of slut-shaming and victim-blaming narrative that feeds into. So this is a more plausible mechanism as to why people get off than opening government, but also establishes why the case is an additional harm of victim blaming much more clearly. Ayal, your POI.
Yeah, no, we are defending status quo. CG tries to convince you that people are currently more forgiving than they are selfish, angry, or irrational. The fact that people are even willing to forgive only comes from societal mechanisms that exist because of a narrative that says forgiveness is a virtue.
We agree in the status quo, people are overwhelmingly forgiving, but we think irrespective of the narrative forgiveness, there would still be an equal bias on either side of the house. So we think that on our side of the house, we're able to equalize that. So even if you think that in the status quo, this narrative already exists in a way that forgives people overwhelmingly so, it's not because of this narrative, it's because of the other narratives that Nehme talks about. Now let me engage with the op bench. Before I go into the opening opposition arguments, I want to just talk about why the op bench as a whole loses the debate and why we didn't spend that much time here in this whip. The first reason is because all their arguments naturally are preempted by Nehme's analysis. So for instance, the opening opposition argumentation that you're going to want vengeance or that this is going to hurt interpersonal relationships is contingent on the fact that you're going to be forgiving too often. The second thing is that the material from Ashish and Sharmay is sufficient in proving to you that the people who are forgiven are overwhelmingly those who are terrible and commit harms. Now, specific arguments coming from opening opposition. They talk about incitements of violence and vengeance. I think that given the fact that we've outframed them, we have demonstrated to you why it is the case that in most circumstances you won't have this kind of violence and vengeance. Their second claim was that this hurts interpersonal relationships. I want to point out two things. First of all, it's bullshit that people will start disclosing serious transgressions because the alternative narratives such as hate and cheating will mean that partners will still not openly and candidly talk about these problems. Again, take open opposition's argumentation. The second thing I want to point out is that it's harmful not to stand up for yourself in interpersonal relationships. That in the status quo, people put up with too much, given Nehme's frame about all the different biases that an individual has to feel moral, religious ethics, and the fact that you know individuals, which means that you're predisposed to wanting to help them. Finally, the closing opposition argument in this debate, that this creates moral constructs and that forgiveness allows for those who control moral constructs to be better through reflecting, through giving something in exchange to make that forgiveness seem genuine. The first response I want to provide here is that those who are rich have strong reasons to try and create unforgiving systems regardless for their own personal benefit. Again, take opening opposition's analysis. But second of all, We actually think when forgiveness is easily bought, as Naomi tells you, you're less willing to provide reparations or do genuine actions because people will accept this kind of insincere forgiveness more often. So actually, we are able to flip the mechanism of that sincereness, and we can point out that when you are giving forgiveness out much more lightly, it means that, for instance, political parties will have to do a lot more to be able to get your vote than just have an apology for the fact that Joe Biden called people super predators in the past. What is the big takeaway from this whip speech? The big takeaway is that the context is about individuals and the way that they think. And we think that the most plausible impacts are that an individual gaslights themselves and no longer engages with the healthy process of understanding their emotions and coming to terms with it, and instead feel guilty for it. This means that people are no longer able to report people as quickly, that you get more victim blaming, and that people are worse off on aggregate. I think this is the biggest impact, and thus I'm very proud to propose. Thank you.
Did anyone else by any chance drop out of the call? No, it seems. Yeah.
Was there another dropout?
No, it's fine.
Was it just that I wasn't speaking?
Yeah, it's fine.
Give me a sec. Sorry, I'm currently on the floor.
Up with.
Yeah, I'm coming. Sorry. Does anyone else have such lack of flexibility that even folding their legs is painful? Probably not.
Me.
Good. Am I loud and clear? Hopefully not too loud, but hopefully quite clear. I'm going to presume that the absence of response is a yes.
Yes.
Awesome. Thanks, Sardip. Speaker, when Nelson Mandela forgave White Africa, he forgave his being jailed. He forgave past policies of injustice. What he recognized was that there is no medicine which will ever live up to the slaughter, to the genocide, to the segregation of the past. But by forgiving, he set the expectation that we can aspire to better, which is the mechanism that Jason refused to engage with. Forgiveness is forward-facing. It says the past has occurred, but by God, if you betray our benevolence by continuing to repress despite our forgiveness, we will be angry, and our anger will be just. CG misunderstands the norm of forgiveness with gaslighting. You do not owe forgiveness. So when you do forgive, people better live up to the standard and the virtue that is set by your forgiveness. We're the only team in this debate, and this is incredibly important because it wins this debate from here, to explain how anger and forgiveness interact and rely on each other to be effective when paired together. That's what shuts out government. Jason walked us into the W. 1, OG, rebuttal without alternatives and integrated with the CG gaslight. Second of all, an OO, an accrued resignation to injustice, a lack of responsiveness to the government harms. Opening government. Where they fall down is by presuming that forgiveness is a discrete event after which you move on. Our extension is threefold. 1, forgiveness structurally requires the recognition of injustice. That's why it is virtuous, i.e. it says you have transcended an injustice, which means that everyone has to mutually acknowledge that what was done against you was in fact unjust in the first place. That is the constructive element of morality that Connor uniquely gives you as a mechanism. Second of all, because of that forgiveness, you express the capacity of reform. You extend an olive branch. What it's saying is the harms you have committed are reparable, just like I can come to terms with the pain that you've inflicted. But third of all, this is crucially how it intersects with anger. It justifies it by granting a moral authority. So Nelson Mandela has a moral authority when he has forgiven what is irreparable about the past, because he's also admitting of what is reparable about the future. So this debate is about creating the forward-looking space that only forgiveness as a virtue does. It gives you agency, where as a minority, you would otherwise have no agency, as OO pointed out, and Reed gave a mechanism for that they did not have. But here's the key to OG's downfall. At their best, you're angry.
and you say you want reparations, but that harm from the past has been irretrievably suffered and can never be recaptured because it has already been born as a harm. So forgiveness acknowledges that that is irreparable while forging the space to rectify what is in your control. It's why just warfare theory exists in religion in the same breath as religions are merciful, because it says if that harm is continuous, if you are still suffering it, if you have offered forgiveness and that forgiveness is reneged, your anger, your injustice is justified in and of itself. And because it's acknowledged as a virtue, society has to acknowledge that it's justified. Under OG and CG, in the absence of forgiveness, there is no point where the past can be quelled. Therefore, you are bound by the past. And this is the really important part of our extension, because it says, where there is no other out for the powerful, for the unjust, for those who have perpetrated crimes, the powerful double down. So that was no response to from Jason to Connor's mechanism, which is you are going to impose legislation which is naturally more constrictive. And you're going to feel right in doing so because you're aggrieved. And society is going to say they could do nothing else. This is the difference. We proved to you how anger and forgiveness interact. Our extension, 1, you acknowledge guilt and you pave a way forward. So it's not that forgiveness is not a mechanism, it's that it is a forward-facing mechanism. But secondly, and more importantly, forgiveness begs the question from the persecutor. How will you forgive me? So it sets a norm to live up to and creates a mechanism for the one who created the injustice to go to the aggrieved and to get some of the virtue back by saying, what's the threshold you set for me to forgive you, after which we can move on together and aspire to better. But thirdly, and this is incredibly important, to not live up to the olive branch extended is blameworthy. Because if to forgive is just and virtuous, then to betray that forgiveness by not acknowledging how virtuous it is also blameworthy and morally reproached. So that's how this norm operates on two sides. It's both condemns those who have shunned the opportunity to be better, but it eulogizes those who've put past injustices which are irreparable behind them. So a man has been granted forgiveness. He is lucky. It's not that he is owed forgiveness by his girlfriend. It's that he's lucky to have the forgiveness of his girlfriend, and he better aspire to the standards set by the virtue of that forgiveness. But fourthly, this is a non-exclusive norm. When you have forgiveness writ large, everyone is incorporated into it, and everyone can feel like they gain something from it. That's what's mutualizing about it. As a minority, you feel like you can gain some form of closure. As someone who is part of the complicit group, you feel like there is a path forward to access. So there is no reason for you to double down on injustice because the expectation is set by this norm that you do something to rectify the past. Opening opposition say, the oppressed minority do not have societal power to do much more. They characterize forgiveness as an internal mechanism for closure, and in so doing, submit themselves to the resignation to the injustice of government side. Our mechanism is twofold. 1, forgiveness gives you the moral authority to follow up with anger in the case where that forgiveness is not acknowledged. But second of all, you can tear down the rich with justice under that circumstance. That's what made Nelson Mandela's moral crusade trustworthy. Look, CG's mechanism of saying this will gaslight you into thinking that you don't have legitimacy misses what forgiveness tells you. It tells you that you are virtuous to forgive because you have transcended an injustice that has been committed against you, which means you are internally also reconciling with the fact that injustice has indeed been committed against you, and that you do indeed have the rights to visit other harms upon that person, but you are choosing not to. And in choosing not to, you are able to set an expectation for what the people around you set as their standard to aspire to. If they fail you, you are right to be angry. And as we said from the start, forgiveness does not exist in a vacuum. So the takeaway from our speech is that anger is only accessible when you acknowledge what is irreparable and you forge a space for what is reparable. When that space, that olive branch is not taken, not heeded, you are just to be angry. But when forgiveness is heeded, it provides a forward-facing mechanism for reparations that no one else in this debate could provide. It was that intersection, that interplay, which wins us the debate with nuance.
All right, then